The wind crawled over the hills like a restless spirit, carrying with it the smell of smoke and ruin. The Carter Ranch had once stood proud on the edge of the Wyoming plains, a modest spread of cedar posts, grazing horses, and laughter that could be heard from the porch at sundown. Now it was nothing but a blackened skeleton. The barn caved in. The main cabin burned down to its bones. Smoke still curled in thin, ghostly ribbons toward the dimming sky. Evelyn Carter lay among the ashes, half buried beneath a beam, her breath shallow, eyes half open. The wind tugged at her hair, steering the dust that clung to her torn dress. Somewhere in the ruin, the sound of a dying horse thudded softly, a sad echo of what had been. She tried to lift her head, but the pain chained her to the earth. Then it came, the sound that broke the silence of the frontier, her cry. It wasn't loud, it was broken, raw, a sound born of both life and death. The canyon walls caught it and threw it back in echoes, stretching her pain across miles of barren land. Her cry drifted beyond the smoke, past the creek that ran dry in summer, past the fence line where her husband once carved his initials into a post. And somewhere beyond those hills, a rider stirred. Before the fire, Evelyn's world had been small but full. Jonas Carter was a quiet man, tall, weathered, with eyes that never missed much but rarely showed what they saw. Folks in town said he used to be someone else before he settled here. Back in the days of the war, when men didn't come home whole, he'd carried another name, the Ghost of Bitter Creek, a gunslinger whose legend bled into campfire tales. But after the war, he buried that name along with his revolvers, built the ranch with his own hands, and vowed never to draw again. They'd been married 12 years. No children, only the land between them, and the kind of silence that comes when two souls have learned to understand without words. The world had forgotten Jonas Carter, and he was glad of it, until the Maddox riders rode in. They came near dusk, 7 of them, dust-coated and mean, led by Van Maddox, a tall man with a jagged scar down his cheek and a reputation that stank worse than his whiskey. He'd heard stories that Jonas Carter once rode with soldiers who carried silver in their wagons. He came hunting for that silver. When Jonas told him there was none, Maddox laughed and said, "Then maybe your wife knows where you hid it." By nightfall, the sky was red with flame. Jonas had been away, riding to the neighboring town for supplies, when the riders came. They beat Evelyn, tore through the cabin, and set it ablaze. She fought to reach the well, but the smoke was thick and cruel. The last thing she remembered was Maddox's boots kicking dirt across her face and the sound of horses riding off into the dark. Now, as dawn threatened the horizon, Evelyn's fingers twitched against the cold earth. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. Somewhere distant, thunder grumbled like an old god waking. She coughed, a weak, broken sound, and the movement dislodged the beam enough for her to drag herself free. Her hands, black with soot, pressed into the dirt as she crawled toward the well. Every inch was agony, but she made it, clutching the rim as if it were the edge of the world. She took one mouthful of water before the pain dragged her down again. And then, she cried out once more, a sound of despair, but also of defiance. It cut through the silence of the land like a blade. Miles away, beyond the ridge of the Broken Horse Hills, a lone figure paused. The man sat astride a chestnut mare, his coat heavy with trail dust. His beard was gray now, his face marked by the years, yet his eyes, when they lifted to the sound, were the same cold steel that once made killers pause before drawing. He had been gone since morning, carrying feed sacks and coffee, unaware that his life was burning behind him. But that cry, that single, shattering cry, reached him. Jonas Carter turned his horse sharply, heart hammering against the walls of his chest. He urged the mare forward, spearing through the sagebrush and over the rise, his eyes narrowing as he saw the dark smoke curling into the twilight sky. The closer he rode, the slower the world became. The smell of charred wood, the sight of a fence broken and scattered, his home, their life, all turned to ruin. He dismounted before the horse even stopped and ran through the ashes barefoot, calling her name. "Evelyn." The wind stole his voice, but then, faintly, he heard her cough. He found her near the well, her skin blistered, her breath weak but still there. He knelt beside her, hands trembling as he lifted her head. "Jonas," her voice cracked like dry bark. They came. The Maddox riders. He closed his eyes for a moment. The world seemed to go quiet, save for the whisper of fire dying in the wind. "I'm here," he said softly, though the words sounded strange to him, gentle and full of something he hadn't felt in years. He gave her water, wrapped her in his coat, and stared out at the line of tracks leading north. For a long while he didn't move. He just knelt there beside her, the sky deepening into night, the stars coming out one by one like old eyes watching. And when she finally slipped into unconsciousness, he whispered, "You hold on, Eve. You hold on." Then he stood, and the years he'd buried began to stare. His hand brushed the scar along his jaw, a reminder of another life, another war. He looked at the burned house one last time. Under the apple tree behind the ruins, something caught his eye, a half-buried chest, the earth still wet around it from the fire hoses that had tried too late to save the place. He knelt and brushed the dirt away. His fingers found the latch. Inside lay two cold dragoons wrapped in an old Union flag, their metal dulled by time but not forgotten. Beside them, a silver pocket watch, cracked but still ticking. He stood there in silence, listening to that faint ticking sound. Each second felt like a heartbeat, not of time, but of something long dead waking again. Jonas Carter looked north, toward the tracks that led into the hills. Somewhere out there, Maddox was laughing, thinking he'd killed a farmer. But the wind whispered differently now. The ghost of Bitter Creek wasn't buried after all. Jonas holstered the guns, tightened the saddle, and whispered to the mare, "We ride, girl." The horse snorted, pawing the ground as if it understood. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the ashes from his boots, Jonas rode into the night. The legend that had haunted the West for 20 years was about to ride again, and those who'd thought him dead would soon remember why the name Jonas Carter once made outlaws tremble. In the canyon beyond, thunder cracked like the cocking of a gun. The storm followed him north, his silhouette cutting through the darkness like a shadow come alive. The frontier would not forget this night. Not after that cry. Dawn broke pale over the hills when Jonas Carter reached the outskirts of Red Bluff. The little town crouched between two ridges, half dust, half shadow, as if afraid to wake before the sun gave permission. The sound of his horse's hooves echoed against the boarded storefronts. Curtains shifted. Doors creaked open just wide enough for a single wary eye. Men who had spent a lifetime forgetting his name suddenly remembered it in the smell of gun oil and storm that followed him down the street. He dismounted outside the saloon. The piano stopped playing before his boot even hit the porch. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and whispers. The barkeep's hands froze around a bottle. A card dealer looked up and swallowed hard, his voice trembling through his throat. "Lord above," someone muttered, "he rides again." Jonas didn't answer. He walked past them without a word, his spurs ticking softly against the wood, his head shadowing the scars that time hadn't softened. At the end of the bar sat the undertaker, black coat dusted with flour from the baker's barrels. Jonas's shadow fell across his glass. "Evelyn Carter," Jonas said. His voice was quiet, like wind under a church door. "Is she alive?" The undertaker hesitated, then nodded toward the back room of his office. "Barely. Doc Avery did what he could. Said she's hanging on by a thread." Jonas didn't blink. He just turned and left, his boots whispering against the ground. The undertaker watched him go, muttering to no one. "If that woman lives, the whole damn territory's gonna bleed before sundown." In the dim back room, Evelyn lay pale beneath a sheet. The scent of burned skin and whiskey mixed with the smell of old pine boards. Jonas sat beside her, his hand trembling as he touched hers. Her fingers were cold, but there was life in them still, faint, but stubborn. She didn't wake, but her lips parted just enough to let a breath escape. "They thought I was dead long before this day," he murmured. His thumb brushed a lock of soot-streaked hair from her forehead. But they were wrong. They woke something worse. He stayed there until dust bled into the window pane. Then, as the lamplight flickered across her face, he rose, kissed her hand once, and stepped back into the cold night. Behind the ranch house, buried beneath an apple tree whose branches had gone dry with the drought, waited the thing he'd prayed never to touch again. The ground was hard, but his shovel was steady. When the metal hit wood, the sound rang through the darkness like the tolling of a bell. He brushed the dirt away with his hands and lifted the chest from the hole. Inside lay the past, two cold dragoons wrapped in an old flag, a silver watch still ticking faintly, and a letter yellowed with age. The handwriting was firm, the ink nearly gone. "Marshal Redding, if I don't make it out of Bitter Creek, tell my wife I laid the ghost down." Jonas folded the letter, set it aside, and drew the guns. He wiped them clean, each stroke deliberate, each movement a prayer and a curse in one. The candlelight played over his face, a mix of weariness, fury, and something deeper, inevitability. By the time the barrels shone like mirrors, his hands had stopped shaking. Doc Avery found him there an hour later, standing beneath the apple tree. "Jonas," he said softly, "you ain't got to do this. You swore off killing when you married her." Jonas turned, the shadows cutting half his face in darkness. "Killing's what it brought to my door. Document. I'm just sending it back where it came from." The old doctor sighed and dropped a canvas bag at his feet. "Medicine, cartridges, food for the trail. Then you'll be needing these. God help you, son." Jonas nodded once, his eyes distant. God already had his chance. By midnight, he was on the road again. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth slick and silver under the moonlight. The mare moved like a whisper through the sagebrush, her breath rising in soft clouds. Jonas rode without hurry, but without pause, a man measured not by speed but by certainty. In Red Bluff, they talked long after he'd gone. The saloon filled again, but no one played the piano. The barkeep muttered, "I saw that look once before, 20 years ago, Bitter Creek. He's not a Muntonite. He's a reckoning." An old prospector by the stove spat into the spittoon and nodded. "If he's truly back," he said, "then God help the Maddox riders." Out on the plain, thunder rolled in the distance. The sound carried across the hills, chasing him north. He could almost hear the voices of the men who'd fallen before, the outlaws, the soldiers, the ones who'd called him Ghost because he never missed and never left a body unburied. But he didn't ride for revenge. Not in the way they'd expect. Jonas Carter rode for something older, heavier, justice shaped by loss and carved into silence. He stopped once before dawn by a lonely creek. The fire he built was small, barely enough to light his face. He opened the silver watch and stared at the hands ticking slow and steady. In the reflection of the glass, he saw himself, not the rancher, not the ghost, but both at once. A man no longer hiding from what he was. He thought of Evelyn's smile the first time she saw the ranch finished, of her laugh when the cold got loose and she chased it barefoot through the mud. He thought of how she never asked about the scars on his hands, how she believed peace could be earned, not given. And then he thought of her lying in that bed, fighting for breath while the men who did it rode free under the same stars. When the fire died, he holstered his guns and rode on. The world was quiet again, but not at peace. He felt it in the wind, the way the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. By the time the first light touched the peaks, he could see the outline of Devil's Backbone Canyon far ahead, the place where tracks disappeared and men who didn't belong often did the same. He knew that's where Maddox would be. It was where all serpents went to coil before striking again. Jonas reined in the mare at the ridge and looked back once toward Red Bluff. The sun was rising behind him, staining the horizon blood red. Somewhere in that town, the woman he loved still fought to live, and the life they'd built smoldered in the ashes. He adjusted his hat, his jaw tightening. "Hold on, Eve," he said softly. "I'll bring the dawn back to you." Then he nudged the horse forward and vanished down the ridge, swallowed by the vast, waiting silence of the west. Devil's Backbone Canyon stretched before him like the scar of some ancient wound. Sheer walls of red rock rose on either side, cracked and clawed by centuries of wind. Jonas rode in slow, watching the ground away a wolf stood his tracks. The sun was barely up, yet the heat pressed heavy against his shoulders. The canyon had a way of swallowing sound, of turning every breath into an echo that belonged to ghosts. He found the first sign just beyond a dry creek bed, a discarded whiskey bottle and the faint print of a horseshoe. Fresh. Too fresh. He crouched, brushing a fingertip over the mark. The earth still held the warmth of the iron. The Maddox riders were near. His jaw tightened. He stood, eyes narrowing toward the narrowing passage ahead, and followed. Hours passed. The canyon twisted, its walls closing in until only a ribbon of sky showed above. The air smelled of sage and dust. He rode carefully, rifle laid across the saddle, senses sharpened to every creak of leather, every flutter of wings. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong here. A muffled sob. Jonas dismounted and followed it on foot, moving through scrub and shadow until he found a boy tied to a post beside a half-collapsed shack. Maybe 12, maybe younger. Dirt streaked across his face, eyes wide with terror. "Please," the boy whispered when he saw him. "They left me. Said they'd come back when the sun went down." Jonas knelt, cutting the ropes with his knife. "Who did this?" "The Maddox riders." The boy's voice trembled. "Said they needed bait. Said there's a mun they want to draw out, a ghost." Jonas's gaze darkened. They found him, he said quietly. He gave the boy a drink from his canteen. What's your name? Luke. Luke, can you ride? The boy nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Then you're coming with me. You show me their trail, and I'll see you safe. The boy hesitated. Are you the ghost they were talking about? Jonas's hand paused on the saddle strap. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, without looking at the boy, he answered, Ghosts don't bury their dead. I do. They rode together through the canyon, the boy leading where he remembered the gang had gone. As they traveled, Luke's fear began to give way to curiosity. He asked questions the way children do, nervously, but hungry for answers. Jonas didn't offer many. When he did, his voice was like gravel over old memories. I fought once, Jonas said. Long ago. Wore blue. Carried a gun for a cause that died before the men did. Luke glanced at him. You were a soldier. Not anymore. Then why are they afraid of you? Jonas looked ahead, eyes shadowed. Because they should be. By sundown, they reached the first camp. 2 of the riders sat drinking near a dying fire, their horses tethered close. Jonas motioned for Luke to stay low behind a rock. The boy nodded, clutching his knees. Jonas moved like a shadow. One of the outlaws stood to relieve himself, humming tunelessly. He didn't even hear the click of the hammer before the butt of Jonas's Colt cracked against his skull. The moon dropped without a sound. The second turned, hand going for his gun, but Jonas was already there. The shot was quick, muffled by the canyon walls. When it was done, the only sound was the whisper of sand sliding down stone. Luke peeked over the rock, eyes wide. You killed them. Jonas holstered his gun. No, he said quietly. They killed themselves years ago. He searched the bodies, found a map scrawled in charcoal on a scrap of cloth, circles marking their camps. The main one was deeper in the canyon, where the rock opened into a basin. That's where Maddox would be. They rode through the night. The air turned cold, and a wind rose, carrying the howl of coyotes. Jonas stopped once, looking out across the ridges. You hear that? He asked. The coyotes. Luke said. Jonas shook his head. No. That sound before it. Like metal scraping. He drew his rifle. A shadow moved against the rock, another rider on lookout. The man fired first, the shot sparking off stone. Jonas's reply was faster. One clean echo. The body tumbled down the slope. When they reached the spot, Jonas stood over him, staring for a long moment. The face was young, younger than he'd expected. He sighed and pulled the man's hat off, laying it over his chest. Luke watched him, puzzled. Why do you do that? Jonas's voice was low. Because I remember when someone did it for me. As they rode on, the boy's eyes lingered on him, as if trying to see through the dust and years. You're not just hunting them, Luke said finally. You're remembering something. Jonas didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the canyon walls, layers of color, ancient as the bones of the earth. I had a boy once, he said. Not much older than you. He died in a fire I didn't start but should have stopped. After that, I put the guns away. Promised her I'd never draw again. Luke's voice was small. Your wife. Jonas nodded. And now they made me break that promise. They camped in silence that night. The firelight flickered against the stone, painting the boy's face gold and Jonas's face red. The wind carried faint laughter from far away, the gang's camp, somewhere beyond the ridge. Jonas listened to it like a moon listening to ghosts. Just before dawn, they found the trail again. The tracks led into a narrow passage lined with dry brush. The boy pointed. That's where they went. There's a clearing ahead. Lots of tents, wagons, guns. Jonas crouched beside him. You stay here. If you hear shooting, you run. You don't look back. Luke hesitated. Will you come back? Jonas gave a small, tired smile. Depends on what you believe about ghosts. Then he moved forward, quiet as smoke. The first light of morning bled across the canyon rim, and through it Jonas saw the camp below. 7 men, bottles clinking, laughter breaking like glass against the stone. He watched Maddox among them, taller than the rest, his scar catching the sun. For a moment, Jonas didn't breathe. Recognition struck like lightning. He knew that face. The sneer. The voice that had shouted through smoke years ago when everything went to hell at Bitter Creek. Maddox had been one of his own, a soldier under his command, a man he'd spared after a seed gone bad. Jonas could still hear the words he'd spoken then. "You're a lucky man, Maddox. Don't make me regret it." And Maddox had laughed, blood running from his lip. "Regret's the only thing you'll ever own, Captain." Now Jonas understood. The fire at the ranch wasn't random. It was vengeance paid back slow. He whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for Evelyn. Then he stepped into the open. The first shot shattered a bottle on the wagon. The riders froze, staring at the figure walking through the smoke of their own campfire. Maddox blinked, then laughed. "Well, I'll be damned. The ghost of Bitter Creek. Thought I burned you with the rest of your past." Jonas said nothing. He holstered one gun, raised the other. His voice, when it came, was soft and steady. "You didn't burn me, Ven. You just lit the fuse." The canyon exploded into gunfire. Dust rose, bullets screamed off stone. One by one, the riders fell, not in chaos, but in rhythm, each shot a note in a grim song. Luke watched from the ridge, the sun climbing behind him, painting the canyon in fire. When the last echo faded, only two figures remained, Jonas and Maddox, standing in the settling dust. Maddox's smile was gone now. "You should have stayed dead, old man." Jonas's hand hovered over his holster. "So should you." The next sound was thunder, not from the sky, but from the gun that decided who would walk out of Devil's Backbone alive. The canyon was still except for the ringing echo of spent gunfire. Dust drifted through the rising light, curling in golden tendrils around the bodies that lay strewn across the rock. Jonas moved slowly through the silence, boots crunching on the gravel, his shadow long in the morning sun. Each man had fallen where he stood, not in vengeance, but in the precise order of their sins. The smoke hung low, bitter and sharp, like the scent of judgment itself. He didn't shoot to kill out of rage. Rage burned fast. This was colder, quieter. He did it because peace demanded it, and peace had waited too long. He paused beside one of the dying men, a young outlaw whose pistol still twitched in his hand. Jonas knelt and eased it away. "Rest now," he said, voice low, not cruel. The man's eyes fluttered shut. A breeze stirred, and with it came the rasp of boots behind him. Then Maddox stepped from the haze, blood on his sleeve, face slick with sweat and dust. His grin was all venom and disbelief. "You never change, Ghost," he said. "Still playing judge, jury, and undertaker all in one." Jonas stood and turned. The canyon between them felt suddenly vast. "I don't judge, Ven. I just finish what others start." Maddox laughed, dry and cracked. "You think the past stays buried, Ghost?" His hand hovered near his gun, fingers twitching like a snake ready to strike. "You think killing me makes you clean again?" Jonas's eyes narrowed. "No," he said softly. "But you won't walk in it any longer." The world seemed to stop breathing. A hawk cried overhead, circling, waiting for the living to decide who would feed the dead. Jonas's right hand drifted lower, thumb brushing the worn handle of his Colt. Maddox's grin faltered, a flicker of fear breaking through his arrogance. The two men stood in the sunlight, motionless, their shadows stretching across the canyon floor. The wind picked up, and in that heartbeat, both drew. The sound was thunder made of iron. One shot, then another. When the dust cleared, Maddox was on his knees, staring at the red bloom spreading across his chest. He looked down, almost confused. You could have let me go," he gasped. Jonas holstered his gun. "I did. Years ago." Maddox's eyes dimmed as he fell, the echo of his final breath carried away by the wind. The canyon went quiet again, save for the rustle of a tumbleweed rolling across the stone. Jonas stood still for a long time, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of memory. He took off his hat, bowed his head, and whispered something that might have been a prayer, or maybe a farewell to everything that once made him human. By the time he rode out of Devil's Backbone, the sun was cresting the ridge. Light spilled across the horizon, washing the red rock gold. The mare's hooves struck sparks from the stone as she carried him home, through country that smelled of wet earth and sage. The clouds broke by the time he reached the Carter Ranch. Rain had fallen while he was gone, taming the ashes into dark mud. The skeleton of the cabin still stood, charred but upright, defiant against ruin. Jonas dismounted and walked toward it, the silence pressing close. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and hope, faint but alive. Evelyn stirred in her bed, wrapped in a quilt patched from whatever hadn't burned. Her eyes fluttered open when his shadow crossed the doorway. "Jonas," she whispered, her voice fragile as the morning light. He stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his coat torn and stained with dust. His hands hung at his sides, empty now. For the first time in days, his eyes softened. "It's done," he said simply. Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I knew you'd come." He crossed to her side, kneeling beside the bed. For a moment, the world felt small again, just the two of them, the wind outside, and the whisper of the rain through the broken roof. She reached out, brushing her fingers over the scar on his jaw. "You came back to me," she murmured. Jonas took her hand and held it against his chest. "I never left," he said, though both of them knew he wasn't talking about the ranch. They stayed like that until the light filled the room. The land outside gleamed, the hills washed clean, the air sharp and new. Jonas rose and stepped out onto the porch. The horizon burned with color, gold melting into silver. Behind him, Evelyn's soft breathing steadied, each inhale stronger than the last. He looked toward the far hills where Devil's Backbone disappeared into the haze. The world was quiet again, but not the same. Somewhere out there, stories were already spreading, of the ghost of Bitter Creek, the men who came back from the dead for love, for justice, for something that couldn't stay buried. Weeks passed, then months. Red Bluff went back to its slow rhythm. But travelers still spoke of him, a tall man riding a chestnut mare, face shadowed, voice soft as thunder. Some said he'd taken up preaching in a mining town, saving lost souls instead of ending them. Others swore they'd seen him at sunset on the high ridges, watching over lone riders who'd lost their way. Children whispered about the ghost and campfire glow, the men who rode with angels at his back and judgment in his holsters. The old men just nodded quietly and said, "Some folks ain't born to rest. Some are made to ride." And when storms rolled over the plains and the wind howled through the canyons, the people of Red Bluff would hear it and remember that night. The cry of a woman, the fire in the hills, and the shadow of a man who refused to stay buried. They'd say they thought they killed a rancher that night. But when her cry broke the silence, they woke something older, the ghost that built the West's most whispered legend. Far beyond where the road ends, under a wide and endless sky, a raider moved between sun and shadow, his trail fading into gold. The wind carried his name, soft as a prayer, across the land that had both made and broken him. Jonas Carter, the ghost of Bitter Creek, rode on, not toward vengeance or redemption, but toward the quiet horizon where all legends go when their story's been told.